Welcome everyone. This is, well, actually not my first new experience because I'm still teaching the wines course. And of course, like everything else here at Miami, we had to go online. And so I am doing my lectures virtually. And because obviously I can't get the wines to the students, I order certain wines to come to actually Oxford Spirits here in town. And so they pick it up. And so we do virtual wine tastings. This week, in fact, it was Spain, and next week it will be Southern Hemisphere and sparkling wines. The semester will then be over. It's actually gone fairly well. I'm actually pretty pleased with everything. The only problem is, of course, is not getting to know the students and interacting with them in the way that you would really like. I miss that. As many of you know, if you've taken the wines course, it really is fun to talk to the students after class. And I always have an open house. I'm hoping when the university, if we do something or are able to, on the second week of September, that I will be able to have the class over to my house for an open house like I always have. I just think it's just that important. And certainly, hopefully, part of many of your Miami experience. Speaking of Miami experience, I thought before we really get started, I ran around campus today and I took this picture. Of course, this is the Delta Zeta house. They're national. And I actually took the picture because it's probably my favorite dogwood on campus. You know, it's right there at the corner. And so I thought that was nice. While I was also there, I went down onto campus and took this picture. This is, in fact, this morning of the obelisk or of the sundial. And so I thought you might enjoy seeing a little bit of campus since you won't be able to hear now. But I made a couple U-turns as I was taking pictures. I thought, who's going to stop me? Nobody. Are you kidding? So anyway, today we're talking about, I thought too, what I typically do with class is I talk about the world of wine, what's happening in the world, and especially, of course, with everything going on now. And so a few things I thought I would share with you. First of all, one of the local distributors tells me that their sales are up for 30% in April from last year. They're lucky. They do a lot of things with stores. And so consequently, these are still open in Ohio. And so they're able to do that. South Africa, again, no reason you should follow this, but the government, again, because of their problems with alcohol, have moved back and forth as to whether or not they should allow wine shipments at all. It was allowed, that it was not allowed for a number of weeks, and now been allowed. They figure they've lost about $50 million because probably about half of the wine made in South Africa is exported. And so that's a shame. Small importers are also being hurt by COVID-19 simply because they have to sort of put together a tank or something to send the wine over where bigger companies don't have to. So that's a problem. Wineries that depend on tasting rooms have in fact found a tremendous loss. And so there really are pluses and minuses in all of this. Speaking of springtime, Bordeaux has had some hail, but only on about 1,500 acres. And so those people, in fact, unfortunately have problems. U.S. wine sales are up, though, 14% this week. And this is week 5, of course, of the lockup. E-commerce is up, though, 300%. And I understand, I myself have bought wine on flash sales in various other ways. And so this is a way that wine is still moving here in America. The other people are showing real problems are the really small business craft distillers because they sell it very often to upscale bars and restaurants, which are not open, and they don't have a lot of sort of walk-in. Of course, they can't for long times. So those are some of the things going on in the world of wine. I think it's always fun to sort of see those kinds of things. As I said, I always report on that when I teach the class. I also thought it would be fun to see what's happening in the world of wine today. This is actually from Burgess Cellars. Many of you know that Tom Burgess was a 1961 alum of Miami University. And so I thought it would be really nice. I got in touch with Steve, his son, to send me some pictures. And so this is what it looks like in California. This is a picture, actually, and I tried to get a couple others. This is a picture of one of our alums. This is Evan Rose, who graduated, if I'm not mistaken, in 2011. I can never keep track. And he is now the assistant winemaker at Stoller Vineyards out in Oregon. And he took this picture at the beginning of March, and then this picture is the exact same vineyard. And so you see how far the grapes have gotten. looks like a great year. And so we're certainly hoping that things will continue to go well in the various wine areas throughout the world. And hopefully we'll be able to visit them again soon. Okay. Any questions on any of that before I get started with the rest of it? Sure. And in fact, we will. And in fact, one of the things, luckily, the distributor was very kind to me. And he said, of course, because there's only a slight color difference between the two bottles, he actually, we will, in fact, be talking about the Monterey. And actually, I have the Sonoma County with me also. And so we'll be able to. I see that. Aha, anticipation. That's why I'm in education. Come on, give me a break, you know? Well, actually, for a couple reasons, and we'll sort of talk about in a minute. One, I wanted something that was widely available and has gotten fairly, not too expensive because I decided I would sort of watch people's pocketbooks as to how much they could, so that we could have, in fact, a lot of people come and join and enjoy. It's gotten really good reviews, and actually, I will delve into that a little more when we, in fact, start tasting that wine. And so, if you hang fire, I will tell you a little bit more about that wine and the winery and why I chose it. Okay? Sure. Great. So this is what we're talking about today: Chardonnay. Chardonnay, of course, is a really fascinating, important grape. In fact, as you can see, obviously a white grape. Really interesting. It's the fifth most widely planted grape in the world. Um, the name may come from a town in southern Burgundy. There is a town called Chardonnay, which means basically place of thistles. But it's really always funny. It's like same as with class. When I do something like this, I delve into it far deeper than I probably need to, but it ends up being a lot of fun. And here, I actually read grammarians, and they say, yeah, that might be the way it came around its name. But there were many, many variations of that name for that grape, and so it's not 100% known. Though some people will tell you, in fact, you see a lot of things, surprisingly, on the internet that are gospel and not. Surprisingly, too, and this is one thing I guess I never really thought about until I was doing this, because, I basically have grown up with Chardonnay, is that up until the 70s, it was planted in Burgundy, and Burgundy is a small area. I mean, the Côte d'Or is less than 30,000 acres. And most of that is planted in Pinot Noir. And so it was planted there. And then it was also one of the three main grapes that go into the blend of Champagne. And so, shockingly, there wasn't a whole lot of Chardonnay planted in the world for a really long time. And it was only with, the explosion of the 70s. As I said, and I remember this, and probably some of you do too. We went so quickly when the wine boom came in the 70s from I want a glass of Chablis to I want a glass of Chardonnay. And of course, if I'm not mistaken, in 1960, there was in fact no Chardonnay at all planted in California. And it was really like 10 years later that there were only about 200 acres. And now there is just shy of 100,000 acres of Chardonnay alone in California. So it gives you an idea about how this grape has exploded. And we'll talk a little bit about the other methods that go on with all of that too in there. Any questions about Chardonnay in general? No? Okay. Chardonnay is also interesting because its parents are Pinot Noir, which, of course, as you can see, is a red grape, and Gouais Blanc, which is a white. Gouais Blanc is really interesting. Pinot Noir, of course, it has been the parent for so many. In fact, the French call that grape sauvage because it is a very, very ancient grape. And so is thought of one that has been around for a very long time. Gouais Blanc, the same way. they think that it actually is a grape from Croatia that might have been brought over by one of the Roman Empire emperors. And here, because they're fairly far away genetically, they easily cross, and probably spontaneous crosses. No one did this. And so they are the parents for many, many, many grape varieties. And Chardonnay is just one of them, which is why, if you again remember, in the 60s and 70s, they often called Chardonnay Pinot Chardonnay, even though it's not a Pinot like Pinot Blanc is, or Pinot Gris, or Pinot Grigio. But it is, in fact, a major grape. Gouais Blanc, almost no one plants it anymore. It just happened to be brought there, and it really ended up being a very good parent with Pinot Noir, which is why it's the parents for so many so many wines with this. So the other thing that I said that we would talk about tonight is white winemaking. And of course, so I want to go into white winemaking, but I also know this isn't wines class. This is a virtual tasting of wines, and I said I would talk about wine tasting. So let's taste some wine, shall we? So the first wine, if you haven't opened it yet, is, of course, the Chloe 18, though some of you also have 17. Again, the distributor, at least here in Oxford, was truly upset because all he saw was 17. But of course, there was a change. He did not know about that. And so 18. And so I have, in fact, a bottle of the 18. As you see, it's a screw cap. And in fact, screw caps for wines, especially ones that should not be kept for more than maybe 1 to 3 years, is perfectly fine. Cork will allow some air to get into the wine, which helps with aging. But in fact, they now make screw caps, which in fact actually allow the exact same thing. And so these are some of the things that go on with this. And so this is the Chloe Chardonnay. Again, I'll try to hold it up to the light so you can see. Hopefully, many of you have this. It's a nice light gold in color. And so we can certainly look at that. And of course, if you swirl this wine, this, of course, is the winemaker. And the reason I chose Chloe, since somebody asked, and actually, I'll be honest, I was not quite aware of this. And I've known Chloe for a number of years. And I have found that all of their wines, while not being expensive, are very, it's one of my favorite phrases, varietally correct, meaning it tastes like the grape. And they don't do a lot of futzing with it so that you can't not taste the flavor of the grape. And it's very interesting. This is the winemaker, Georgeta Dane. She came originally from Romania. She and her husband. She worked for Kendall Jackson for a while and then worked for the wine group. And so the wine group, which has Flip Flop and there's one of the other big ones, Cupcake, and another others, like 60 different brands, Concanon, etc. She now leads this division in making wines, which sort of in an old world style. This is Sonoma County, as you can see. So here's the technical information. 100% Chardonnay. It was harvested in September of 2018. Harvest is normal, 23 to 25 degrees Brix. That means the amount of soluble solids, most of that being sugar. Alcohol, a little high, 14.3 for a white, but still not bad. It has a little residual sugar in it to it. So let's smell this wine, as I always say in class. Really nice, bright, a little bit of, certainly some citrus, but there's more going on. It's almost an olive, sort of a savoriness that's in that wine. Some of that comes a little bit from the oak, though this doesn't see a lot of oak, but there is oak in Chardonnay, and we'll talk about that when the wine is produced. And finally, of course, taste this wine. I try to draw some air through that wine. Again, a kiss of oak, a little bit of butter, but more into that sort of pears and apples in the flavor. Nice and crisp, I think, on the mouth, with at the same time a little bit of creaminess that makes it, very, very nice. Unfortunately, they could not give me. They gave me the technical information for the 18. They could not for the 17. But I would think that they really are fairly close. I mean, let's be honest. Chloe is, they make, though I never did see an exact, but they certainly make thousands of cases of this. Most of this wine is Sonoma County fruit. In fact, to be called Sonoma County, 75% of the grapes have to come from Sonoma County. And a lot of it does come from the Russian River Valley, which in fact is very well known for its quality Chardonnays. So again, let's see what I can show here. Here are the winemaker notes. They say rich sophisticated wine. Of course, what are they going to say? It's terrible. With ripe flavors of fresh citrus, apples, and pears, with notes of creamy butter, followed by soft hints of vanilla and toasted oak. Well balanced, sophisticated intensity, creamy mid palates, unforgettable, silky finish. Yes, it is a very, very nice, well made Chardonnay. And that's why I decided that I would use it. Any questions on that? Not at all. Someone asked how long you should keep a bottle of wine before drinking it. Well, of course, I can tell you that probably about 90% of all wine is drunk within 24 hours of purchase, and only about 6% actually keep wine. I would say, as a general rule, and part of it depends on quality. If you're buying everyday wine, usually they're meant to be drunk from 1 to 3 years of bottling. If it is well stored, which basically means keep it out of the light, keep it out of the heat. That's why cellars are good. If it gets to have a cool, and especially you don't want real up and down temperatures. You want a nice even temperature. Obviously, things are going to change a little bit from summer to winter, but you really want a very slow change of temperature at all. And then the wines will last for a fair length of time. After that, you really get to a quality thing. There are some wines, again, more reds than whites, but surprisingly, Rieslings can age very, very well. In fact, it was funny. I had a good conversation with a former student who is currently teaching in the military system in Germany, and he just bought a house, and these people left German Rieslings from the 60s. And I said, depending on the producer, which of course is always important, those wines still may be drinkable, which is pretty amazing when you think that most white wines, pretty much are, I would say 80, 90% are pretty much, have lost most of their things after about 5 years. But good whites, of course, can last for a long time. Reds typically longer, but again, it's always quality. The more thing, and then things like Cabernet will last a lot longer, say, for example, than, Gamay or something like that. Most wines, the better the quality, the longer they will typically last. I hope that answers that question. Anything else? Sure. It actually is the oak. Oh, the question was what makes the Chloe taste a little buttery? And of course, it's the oak. The oak will typically have vanillin and, in fact, a little. Oh God, I want to make sure I'm saying this right. It's both vanillin and a little butyric acid, which will have some of the buttery overtones that you will get. So typically, it is from the oak. Chardonnay gets up. Chardonnay, it's been sort of interesting. And again, I read extensively getting ready for this just so to sort of give you a lot of information, but and right information, since I found lots of wrong things too. But Chardonnay gets a bad rap because it really, if you make it in an unoaked version, which there are a lot, they may not have the complexity. And winemakers like to play with Chardonnay because you can. Chardonnay, in many ways, is the white grape that we treat like a red. Most whites get little to no skin contact. Well, we give skin talk, meaning we allow the skins to sit in the juice before we start fermentation. Doesn't typically happen. Two, what you end up having is we typically ferment it cool, but we will barrel ferment it and we will barrel age it, which typically, again, we don't do with a lot of whites. And so we really do. Chardonnay is one that can have a lot of differences from that, from in fact the very light to the extremely sort of oaky, buttery Chardonnays. And again, they all have their place in the sort of in the palate with that. Okay. Any other questions? Sure. For one thing, and that's one thing that is, it's really funny. Oh, and the question was, thank you, Emily, was to why does Chardonnay taste so different around the world? And the French have a term called terroir, which is basically the whole natural environment that the grapes grow in. And so it is the amount of rain it gets, the amount of sun it gets. But also, and this is very important to remember, I think a lot of people don't, is the human factor comes into that too. How is it trellised? When was it picked? So, for example, when you're making champagne, you pick the grapes when they're quite young and very acidic. When you're, again, what I would call old world Chardonnays, like Burgundies, again, aren't picked when they are super ripe. And depending on where you are in the world, for example, Chablis almost uses no oak, only in the sort of the top ones. And actually, my favorite ones have typically been ones without oak, but they have a wonderful stoniness. And a lot of that has to do with the environment. Oak, or excuse me, Chardonnay from California, especially, and you can again see this in Argentina and other warm climates, will get a lot more of that citrus. Central Coast Chardonnays, especially, tend to have this sort of tropical fruit character, which is often very, very identifiable. You know, guava, pineapple, etc. And so it really comes down to where the grapes are grown, which of course is true for all grapes. And that's what makes grapes so interesting when it comes to climate change, also, because nothing, nothing sort of records the climate like grapes do. And this is why winemakers are worried around the world, because when we have years that are too warm, then the grapes lose some of their intensity of flavor and so aren't as good. And then sometimes you have to pick earlier. So there are ways things to do that. But that really is why the wines can taste so differently from around the world. And we have this new world, old world idea, and it isn't always true. I mean, yes, to a great extent you will taste, but trust me, I've been in way too many tastings where it's like, oh, this is obviously French, or this is obviously European, this is obviously American. I was wrong again, and most people are. But there are general guidelines along those lines. Okay? Any questions? Okay, let's move forward. Again, what I thought I would do is talk about winemaking, and I'm going to go run through these very quickly, but it really is fascinating. And this is what makes wine so amazing, because vintage is different. By the way, vintage, the only thing it means is that the grapes were picked in the same year, and we'll talk about that. So again, good vintage, bad vintage, of course, but a vintage wine can be terrible. It just depends on the year. Night harvesting is really helpful. And again, are you picking by hand, as you're seeing there, and so you have grapes like this still on the cluster, or are you picking by machine? And trust me, machine harvesting, as you can see, I brought this one specifically because this is in Chablis, this is in France, and everyone thinks, oh, they do everything old style, old world, etc. There is, in fact, machine harvesting going on everywhere in the world. And more better wines are, in fact, picked by machine. If you grow good grapes and so have nice, clean fruit, they can certainly make fine wine out of machine harvested grapes. And some of the machines are amazing in what they do. We are going to see a lot more robotics in the vineyard, I think, without a doubt about this. So the grapes come in. Typically, they will come through a crusher destemmer. This is a picture from actually from UC Davis. This is an old picture from Ohio. This is Tony Dubevic up at Chalet Debonnet. And in fact, what you're seeing over on the right-hand side, you see that big pile. Those are, in fact, the grape stems. And of course, the grapes themselves fall down through. And then typically with white wine making, and if we do this again and talk about reds, I will show you the differences. With white wine making, the grapes almost immediately go into the press because you want them to be fresh. You also want to keep them cool so that they don't get off odors because of bacteria and fungi and all of those kinds of problems with all of this. And so that's the first thing that happens. Picked by hand or picked by machines, and then if they're picked by hand, they go through the crusher destemmer. This is what the inside of it looks like. It basically just beats them off of it. So it's not actually that mild in comparison to getting rid of them. The next thing that happens, of course, is the grapes get pressed. And there are a number of kinds. This is a basket press. I took a Chateau Yquem, which is very old style. Of course, this is modern, stainless steel, but this is what they were made out of wood originally. This is probably the most common. This is a bladder press. And inside is like an inner tube. And so they fill up the sort of the area with the grapes. They close it off. And then, of course, they apply pressure. It expands. And so applies nice, good, constant, gentle pressure to the grapes, because you don't want to press too hard. Otherwise, you get off flavors and aromas from the skins and seeds and all of those things that go on. Here, in fact, is the picture you see with the deflated bladder. This is Dave Page. In fact, he's an Ohioan. He was as a longtime winemaker at Adelsheim. He's now owns his own vineyard, Dave Page Vineyards. And this is here with a press. And there, in fact, is the bladder, the thing that goes in the center of it. So it's sort of, this is how the grapes are, in fact, pressed. This is, in fact, a very new one. You can see sort of inside. And then, of course, when it expands, you see how it presses those grapes against the sides with that. What you're left, sometimes they'll add even rice hulls and other things. Because, again, if you ever tried to press fruit like this, it's really gooey and it's tough to get the fruit out. So they very often will put rice hulls that'll keep the individual berries away from each other so you get more juice. And they will use enzymes. They don't tell you about these things very often, but enzymes to break up the skins or break up the cells a little bit so you can get more juice out of it. And so that's the first thing that happens, is basically getting the juice. Any questions, Emily? Yes. The Willamette Valley? That's a very interesting question, especially the question is about the Chardonnay coming out of the Willamette Valley of Oregon. The Willamette has been known for Pinot Noir. Probably, oh God, like over 60% of all the grapes in the Willamette are Pinot Noir. Another like 18% are Pinot Gris. The thing is, especially if you look at Burgundy, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are what grow in Burgundy. The other thing is, it is also economics. If you buy a really, really good Pinot Gris, it might set you back $30. If you buy a really good Chardonnay from California or Oregon, then very often they can charge you $60, $75. And so Chardonnay has become the darling current in Oregon of the new plantings because, again, you can simply make more money from it, and it also is a very good place to make wine. I'm certainly not shorting them with that. As to whether it's old world or new world style, that's a good question. I really think it mirrors Willamette Pinot, because Willamette Pinot is not like the really big fruity style that you have in California, which isn't always, but certainly places. But it's not really as austere, and again, I'm making terrible assumptions here, as you see in Burgundy. So it's sort of in between. And I've only had a couple, and they've been very good. Speaking of Pinot Noir in the Willamette, it's also interesting because I really felt for a long time, again, they got good money for it, but they were always too heavy, too clumsy. Now they're making Pinot Noirs that just have the elegance that you expect out of a good Burgundian Pinot Noir. And so they've become more Burgundian in the last 8 or 10 years. Maybe that has to do with Drouhin, whose wine we're tasting tonight, in fact, owns Domaine Drouhin, Oregon, or DDO, because it's easier to say, makes really good, wonderful Pinots, as do so many people in that area. Any other questions before we go on? Sure. Sure. The question was asking about the quality of the harvest in 2019 and what we think is coming in 2020, especially vis-a-vis the coronavirus. 19 was, for the most part, it seems to be a good year. I will tell you, again, many of the world, 15 was wonderful. And so if you can find those wines, that was very good. 17 was bad in a lot of places in the world, especially in Europe, simply because between hail and frost and all kinds of things. And of course, we dealt with some fires here in America too. 19 looks to be a good year, I would say, across the board. The problem ends up being, of course, the wines are being made now and they're not being shipped. Of course, some of the first whites are coming out. Some of the first rosés are coming out. And the quality actually looks to be pretty good. 2020, again, luckily, and I think we're starting to see this, that people who work outside and again do the proper distancing, etc. So I think from that standpoint, it will be good. I will tell you, and in fact, I have to remember to tell my students that if you're looking for harvest interns, because many people don't know this, but most wineries will hire harvest interns. These are typically college-age students, but not necessarily. Certainly can be older. That they, in fact, have people from all over the world. Again, my friend who you saw, Evan, at Stoller, he was lamenting the fact that they were supposed to have 8 people from Europe, and if they're lucky, 2 are still trying to come. And again, the problem is you have to get to Oregon for this. But he, in fact, I was going to tell my students, if you know people who have a real interest, that there probably will be a fair amount of openings for harvest interns in this coming harvest here in the Northern Hemisphere. I have another student, Victor Barraclough, who's one of the 18 of 9. He's currently working a harvest in Central Otago down in New Zealand. I hope to have him talk to class next week. So they are out there. But I think that, it looks like, except for a couple minor hailstorms, etc., which is nothing compared to 17, it looks like 20 is going to be a good year. If, of course, they get the people out there to do the things that are needed. But currently it's been okay, at least here in the West Coast. A little more problem in Europe. But they're really hoping, again, hopefully if we can beat this thing and come up with the right ways to handle ourselves, that the wines, hopefully, of 2020 will be pretty good and we'll have something to celebrate. That would be a good thing. Okay, I'll continue on. This is often what you see on your left is what grape juice looks like after it comes out of the press. It has a tremendous amount of soluble solids. It looks like orange juice. On the right, you see, of course, it's a lot clearer. Settling is the first thing it does. After the grapes come out of the press, typically they've tried to use centrifuges, but it seems to be too hard on the juice. And so now they simply put them in tanks, they chill it down, and they let the soluble solids for 12, 24, 48 hours fall out. And so that's what they do prior to fermentation. Chaptalization is something else you may not be aware of. Now, in California, it's not allowed. It's certainly allowed in Ohio, and it's certainly allowed in France, and especially as you go further north. Chaptalization is the addition of sugar to the must, that's what we call it, the juice that we have there, to increase the alcohol level. And in a bad vintage, there are times that you have to do this. And again, to make obviously a biologically sound wine. And so they will add sugar. Again, as our climate warms, they're using less and less of this, but it is something that is often done in wineries. It's illegal in California, but then they're very warm. It's illegal in Australia, so it's too warm. But they actually can acidify, and so a lot of these places will add acid if there's not enough acid in the grapes, if they've let them stay on the vine too long, because the sugars rise, but the acids decrease as the grapes ripen. And then, of course, the most important thing, fermentation. And this, of course, uses yeast, Saccharomyces, again, that you don't really need to know. But so, again, this is where what happens is it's a breakdown of a complex material to a simple one. Cheese making, bread making, so many things. We rely so much on fermentation. In this case, and especially important, as you see, in the absence of oxygen, we produce ethanol. And of course, let's face it, wine tastes great, but one of the reasons that we drink it is for the effect, and that's where ethanol comes into it. Look at this grape cluster. What you see, and you've all seen this, especially outside and or even in the store, how there's a gloom on the outside of the grapes. Those are billions of yeast cells and other bacteria and fungi that are living there. This is what they look like. And so, of course, they work in the fermentation process. And so what you have, again, you don't need to worry, but you start with sugar and you end up with ethanol, but especially carbon dioxide. And in fact, let's face it, wineries put off a lot of carbon dioxide. And the other thing that comes off is heat, which is why when you ferment white wines, you want a refrigerated jacket or something like that, because you want the fermentation to be slow and cool so that you don't lose all the delicate fruit and flowery aromas that you typically find in a white wine. And so it's very important that you typically have some kind of refrigeration jacket, because your typical white wine fermentation will be like 55, 60 degrees. And where your typical red wine fermentation may be 85 or 90. And so tremendously difference in how you take care of the wine with the fermentation temperature that goes on with that. And yeasts are important. Again, I just show you this. This in fact shows you the exact same juice fermented with two different yeasts. And there are many different strains of yeast. And in fact, you could buy certainly designer strains, believe it or not. And you see that, in fact, the one strain really brought out the passion fruit in that wine. And so these are some of the differences that can happen. And so this is another tool in the winemaker's kit, is using certain yeasts to bring up certain aromas and flavors. Any questions? I think I'll drink. The question was the various pressing methods. Do people still stomp on the grapes? They don't do that very often, and not in the, obviously in any large scale production. But it's interesting. I just finished doing a lecture on Spain and Portugal, and in the production of port, historically, they had these big stone troughs called lagars. And in the evening, after they've done the picking, typically it would be the men who would come in and they would form a single file. And the manager or the foreman would either tap out a bead or something, and they, in fact, would trod on them by foot. And in fact, a couple companies are trying to come up with sort of fake feet because they feel that the best wines, because again, probably the gentleness of the pressing, do best for that. And then they actually then ferment the wine halfway through in the stone thing. And then, of course, what they do to make port is they add a big gulp of alcohol, which, of course, cuts the fermentation, which is why all ports are sweet. That's probably, and even now today, most of them use machines, but that's probably the only place left where some people are still pressing on any kind of scale. Any other questions? No? I'll continue. Again, this shows you the difference in fermentation. What happens is the yeast, of course, gobble up the sugar, and they grow very, very fast in the beginning because there's oxygen dissolved in the wine, in the juice. But what happens is once the oxygen goes, then they have to go to a different pathway. And so the end pathway of that process, luckily, is ethanol. And so you have the yeast, of course, with the sugar content fall dramatically, and of course the alcohol rise dramatically. And so eventually you end up with a wine that is dry. It is possible to have a stuck fermentation, which you don't want. Though some wines, in fact, white Zinfandel came about because of a stuck fermentation. There was still residual sugar, and they said, well, why don't we bottle this? And so, of course, later on, Sutter Home was selling millions of cases of it. And so this ends up being one of the things that happens. And so fermentation is very important in the process. This is just a little recap. Destemming and crushing, then of course it gets pressed, the juice gets clarified. And then of course you can, especially with Chardonnay, do some barrel fermentation, but most white wines are done in stainless steel or some other inert material. And then of course you can have barrel aging. And then of course it goes to fining and clarification. Fining, or I guess I should say too, once the wine ferments, and even of course after you've settled, the next thing you need to do is rack. And that's because you have the particulate. It can either be what's left over or the dead yeast now that need to be taken away. They're not always done. There are certain wines, but we won't go into that. And so you have to rack. And so this is what you have on the bottom. Those are called the lees, by the way, Lees. And so, but if you let them, and if they're too thick, they can make some off flavors and aromas because of sulfur compounds. And so you want to get it off. And so racking ends up being very important in winemaking. Winemakers rack constantly. Here again, this is on a big scale where you are in fact racking from one large container, basically one large stainless steel vat, to another one. Here, in fact, I was lucky to have some pictures, of course, showing you racking on a small scale from individual barrels. And of course, here's what it looks like when it goes into the barrel, which I guess you do with Chardonnay probably more than any other white wine. I was really lucky, and in fact, I took this picture. One of the reasons I did use a wine from Drouhin was I was able to visit there in 17, and while I was there, they were racking barrels, and of course, I was thrilled that they were racking barrels. They probably thought, who's this wacko American? And you can see he's using a tasse vin to look and see when he starts seeing yeast coming out of that. In other words, where he's getting to the bottom, then he has to stop. There's the close-up effect of my picture, not exactly centered, but you can see it's starting to turn a little cloudy. And this is what's left. This is the gunk at the bottom of the barrel. And they will try to get a little bit of the wine out of there, but that is, in fact, is the lees or the yeast that was in the bottom of that barrel of the white wine that they were making in Burgundy at Drouhin. The next thing they do is fining. Fining, again, they want to get rid of, who wants a wine that's dirty, that's cloudy? And so they need to get rid of the particulate matter. And one of the ways that they do is fining. Probably the most common one they use is bentonite. Bentonite's a clay, and it has a charge. And so what they do is they make a slurry, and they put it across the top. And as it falls through, it picks up, because it has a charge, it picks up the particulate matter, it falls to the bottom, and then, of course, you rack. And that's what happens with that. Here, in fact, it shows you another thing. It shows you how fining works. And so the particles stay at the bottom. They've grabbed the particulate matter, and so you rack. Do I have that picture? No, I guess I don't. I meant to add it. One fining agent that a lot of people still use, especially in Spain, are egg whites. They actually take the egg whites, and hundreds of them, so many per how many liters of wine they have, and they will mix them up with a little bit of wine. They put it over the top. And of course, the albumin, being a protein, it slowly settles through and it picks up the particulate matter. And so some people do use, which is why, of course, the Spanish have so many desserts that use egg yolks. It's because they have all this egg yolks left from wine. And so that's what happens. And so fining is what happens with the wine in there. As you can see, settle classification, fining, and then if they have to, and the big boys typically do this, they have filters. You want to filter as little as possible, because when you filter, you can take out flavor and aroma compounds. So the less you disturb the wine, typically the better the wine will be. Obviously, especially if you started with good grapes. Questions, Emily? Okay, that's fine. No problem at all. We can. Not a problem. Okay. Um, After the wine is done, this is one thing that's done a lot with both red and white wines, but especially white wines, and that is what's called cold stabilization. In this case, what we find is there are two main acids in wine: tartaric acid or tartrates, like cream of tartar, or malic acid, malates, which is the acid that makes apples have their tartness. And so these are the two main ones, but especially tartrates. What happens is, of course, like anything, if you have a material, a liquid that's fairly warm, it will stay dissolved. The tartrates stay dissolved. But if it gets cold, like for example, when you put it in your refrigerator, you may pull that bottle out and think, oh, what is this gunk at the bottom of my bottle? And here what it is just tartaric acid. The Germans even have a term for it because, of course, Germany's cool. So the cooler the climate, typically the more you have. They call them rhinestones. And you would have them. They're perfectly fine, but people don't like to see them, as you can see on the bottom of this bottle, or this rosé right here. You can see them at the bottom of that bottle. So what they do is they cold stabilize. They take the wine and put it down to like 27 degrees for a couple of weeks. And what happens is the excess tartrates fall out of the wine, so they don't fall out when you get the wine. And in fact, there's lots of it. You can see this picture from Germany. He's taking tartrates crystals off of that big barrel right there. And so you will find the tartrates, of course, that's what gives wine. But again, when there's too much and people don't like them, they will not hurt you. I've opened many a German bottle, especially used to be. Many people did not cold stabilize. But today, practically everybody cold stabilizes with the wine. The next thing, especially, that ends up being very important with Chardonnay and, of course, with reds, is barrel aging. And again, how many months, whether or not the barrel is new or old, because again, a new barrel is like a new tea bag. You're going to get lots of flavor out of it. And of course, after it's used once, there's a lot less. And then 3 or 4 times, you do also get some important characteristics. Microoxygenation softens the wine, but you don't get the oak flavor as the barrel ages. So again, depending on who you are, you may use a barrel once or twice. You may use a barrel for 5 or 6 years, or you may sell them to other people too. And barrels, of course, are shipped all over the world. Many scotches, in fact, are made in sherry barrels. And so barrels are very important in a number of industries, and certainly under those things. After that, of course, you have blending and bottling. And so the wine then ends up being done. Okay, so let's taste our second wine, shall we? I know you've been waiting. The second wine is Saint Veran. I decided I would go with the French wine second for a couple of reasons. And there's usually a reason why I do some of the things that I do. As I said, this is Joseph Drouhin Saint Veran. It's also in a screw cap, which is sort of surprising. I imagine most of Drouhin wines, in fact, come in with a cork. And again, if I pour a little bit of that wine, and you can see it there, I think lighter than the Chloe. Very light in color. Typically, I have a white background, certainly a look, but it is a very light, pale color. And again, if you, I can tell you a little bit about it. Again, very close plantings, very low things. They're kept this wine. One of the reasons I do this is because they use no artificial yeast, so they use natural yeast to come in with the grapes. They only age it in stainless steel, so this wine sees no oak. Beautiful area, though. So let's swirl this wine and smell it. I have a confession to make. I really like white Burgundies. The problem is I can't afford the real expensive ones anymore. I mean, even like Pouligny Montrachet, which I used to be able to afford, which comes basically from the heart of the white wine area of Burgundy, they've now gone $60, $70, $80 or more. And so I don't buy them. Down in this area is Puy-Fuissé, which can be, you can find them for not very much, and they can be very good. In good vintages, the wines from Saint Veran, Macon Village, Puy-Vinzels. There's 4 or 5 areas down there that are really, really good. And this nose, citrus, a little stony, just wonderful, fresh aroma coming out of that glass. Oh, so nice. And if you taste this wine, drier than the Chloe, crisp, fresh, a lot of, again, pear, really nice flavors, really pleasant, and really clean on the palate. And again, as you know, this wine is not tremendously expensive and just beautiful. And really sort of wonderful. It could certainly last for several years, but this is an 18. You could certainly drink it through 2021 without any problem. It typically would get a little bit yellower, a little bit rounder in the flavors. This is the area around Saint Veran. This is the hill of Souleutre, very, very important in there. A lot of limestone soils. Chardonnay does very well on limestone. I love this picture. Again, this wasn't even a wine picture, but it's like it shows you the town of Saint Veran and the hills. It's just absolutely beautiful country down there in southern Burgundy. And again, southern Burgundy, especially around the town of Beaune, that is Chardonnay country. And this is, of course, where it's been grown for hundreds of years in there. Any questions, Emily?
We can wait until the end to get to
Wine
that.
then, or the third wine. We'll go to La Crema. And this, in fact, I'm doing the Monterey. And I have the 18. By the way, Monterey is a cooler region, and Chardonnay really likes it cool. Burgundy is a relatively cool region. And so this is why things from Anderson Valley, things from, again, the Willamette Valley, I'm trying to think where else. And some of the cooler climates, like Santa Rita Hills, down in the south and the central coast, they really are Russian River. These are the places where Chardonnay really shines. If it's too warm, they tend to get clunky. And the problem is with Chardonnay is it will lose its acidity fairly quickly. And that's what you don't want with this. Again, the wine is light, a little more golden. I apologize, I don't have a white background, but a little more golden than the Saint Veran was in there. And again, if you swirl and smell this wine, very different. Again, now you're seeing some oak in this wine, and so it gives it sort of more of that creamy, buttery aroma. Again, sort of pears, almost baked pears, baked apples. Oh yeah, they're really, really pretty. Maybe a little olive too, but a little touch of butter. And of course, you taste this wine. Clean, crisp, really nice mouthfeel. You know, really nice and silky. Finish is really, really crispy in there. 100% Chardonnay. It's been 6.5 months in barrel. pH is fairly high, 3.6. Alcohol, 13.8. Again, smell this wine, taste this wine. I did bring an extra glass with me in case you do have the La Crema Sonoma Coast. By the way, should have mentioned that. Sonoma Coast is a wonderful place for Pinot Noirs and Chardonnay. It actually, obviously, shockingly enough, is an AVA that goes along the Sonoma coast, but then goes inland. But they're doing a new, oh, by the way, AVA, American Viticultural Area. And so these are the areas where only certain grapes can be grown, but 85%, or depending on what it is, 85% of the grapes have to come from that area to use that name, and even higher with vintage. And so that's what happens. Sonoma Coast is one of those, I hate to use the word hot area because it's actually quite cool, but it's one of those areas that has a tremendous amount of interest. And typically, when you see Sonoma Coast on a label, you'll pay a little bit more money, certainly, than you will Sonoma County. So let's see what the difference is with this. Probably the color is about the same, and certainly it is. If I swirl this wine and smell it, actually very light, maybe not as crisp, maybe not as bright in the nose, maybe a little rounder, but still very much that Chardonnay, baked apple, pears kind of aromas there. A little bit of that, again, that sort of smokiness. And I apologize, I did not pull up the sheet, the technical sheet on this wine. So I taste this. Maybe a little creamier, a little fuller in the mouth. Nice big, yeah, much creamier, fuller in the mouth than the Monterey. Might actually be grown on a slightly warmer site. Again, because they've been pushing it more and more to the exterior of this. But La Crema just does a good job. I mean, I really do think that they do. I think that they really are very nice wines at really pretty good prices. And so I've liked a lot of their wines. Of course, that's one reason that we use them tonight in there. They say aromas of, this is of course for the Monterey, minor lemon, grilled pineapple, which you certainly get, guava, followed by flavor of nectarine, papaya, lemon, tangerine with touches of spice and minerality. Balanced acidity lingers on a long finish in that wine. And so those are some of the things that, in fact, you are tasting in there. Any questions? the question was about letting a wine breathe. In other words, should you open it beforehand or after? Um, I'm a, I, this is a toughie, especially it's a toughie for me. If the red is young, and if, and you want to drink it, typically young reds are my first candidate for putting it into a decanter or something along those lines. I've never been a real fan of the aerators. I mean, they sort of have their place, but I can't say I really like the wine better. And so typically my first choice for letting a wine breathe would be young reds, simply because once the oxygen starts to interact, and that's what's happening here, start to interact with the tannins and flavors, aromas, very often the wine will soften up. And so you'll find that a wine will bloom, especially if they're good. It's really tough to say, and that's why, of course, buying a case helps over time, and also sort of having it and having a little bit and having, again, a decent sized glass and sort of letting it swirl and sort of open up. By the way, nothing changes more in a glass than Pinots. Pinot Noir especially does that. But I have found, I remember doing a tasting of, in fact, a very good Syrah, and the one that everyone sort of disliked the most early, like 3 or 4 hours later, was the one everyone liked best. And it wasn't because we had drunk all the rest of the wine. It was because it really, in the interaction with the oxygen, really opened up. And so I would say that it's the younger, harsher reds, most importantly. Whites, no, not so much. And I am always really careful about older wines. I have seen, especially if you have an older wine, they can deteriorate very quickly too. They have more of a delicacy. And I have, in fact, obviously, not my own, but tastings of older wines, and you'll open it up and it'll be delicious, and a half hour later it'll be gone. And so you really need to be more careful with older wines. Younger wines, in wines, you have a fair amount of leeway as to what you do. I know I didn't give you a hard and true answer, but that's a problem with wine. I don't think there is hard and true answers when it comes to a lot of these things. Okay? Other questions? Sure. The question was time from harvest until bottling. First of all, of course, it depends on the style of wine. Typically, let's say average whites, and let's say no barrels. Typically, the wines would be picked September, October, depending on where you are. This is, of course, all northern hemisphere. September, October. You try to get them into the winery as quickly as possible, and in fact, very often they will maybe treat them with a little bit of sulfur to prevent browning and disease. You know what it is. I mean, you let anything out, it's going to start rotting. Well, grapes, especially with all that sugar in them, are going to do the same, and so they need to be protected. And very often they're chilled. Also, this is why night harvesting is so important, so you can chill the wine, chill the grapes. So they bring it in as quickly as possible. Obviously, pressing is right away. You maybe have a day or two for settling, and then fermentation typically is done in less than 2 weeks. Then, of course, you have to rack that off, and of course, then you may have to rack it several times, fining and filtering. It is possible, and in fact, I mean, let's face it, 2019s are already on the market. And so you can have white wines ready. Well, let me give you the most extreme example. Beaujolais Nouveau is picked in September, and it's drunk. You can start drinking it the third Thursday of November. And so the wines can actually be made fairly soon. Reds, of course, it depends on your oak regime. Many wines may spend 18, 24 months in oak. We tasted a wine today I did my class, and they literally left it spent 2 years in oak, and then they kept it in the bottle for 6 years before they released it, which is amazing, really, when you stop and think about it. So it really runs the gamut, but it can be as little as 60 days. I would say a lot of whites, again, some of them will spend a few months, and so we will start seeing 19s. We are already seeing 19s on the market. And then especially a lot of rosés will be 19s because trust me, you can find a lot of good buys for 18 rosés now because most people don't think they last more than a year. Some of them can. I had a very cheap one today that was delicious. And so you see that. And then, but most whites, Chardonnay again, because it spends time in oak. Now we're just seeing the 18, like the Chloe 18 just came out. So it really depends on the wine, but that gives you at least some idea of the scope that we're dealing with. Other things, Emily. Yeah, sure. Sure. I understand, Paige, it's your birthday. So Anthony says, happy birthday. You are Miami mergers. So you are to be, what shall I do? Toasted. Happy anniversary. Happy birthday. That's wonderful. By the way, that was, of course, the bulk. We've tasted through the wines and we've talked about white winemaking. And so this, of course, as you can tell, is the end of the presentation, but I'm happy to talk to you and take questions. Good question. How well or how cold should you have a Chardonnay, and what would pair well with these wines? First of all, in fact, it's funny because the couple of the reps who are friends of mine also they know I'm a real bug. Um, all too often, especially with whites, they're served too cold. Some people, of course, I mean, you may go into a wine bar or just go into a bar, and because they keep the wine with the beer, they keep it entirely too cold. And so I spend much of my first time, if I pick up a white wine at a bar, a wine bar, and I have a glass of wine, I spend a lot of my time like this, holding my wine to warm it up because it's like anything. I mean, the most common example I use is think about if you open a can of soup. You can barely smell it. But of course, once it warms up as you're cooking it, you can smell it all through the house. Well, the same thing is true of wine. Usually, and I like them maybe to be a little cooler because they're going to warm in the glass, but I think, especially a Chardonnay, 58, 60 degrees, and I'm not really doctrinaire because it's going to warm up. But you do want a wine because you'll be amazed at how waiting, 10 minutes or even just, I'll use my hands and 5 minutes later, it's like, oh, I smell wine. Where before I didn't smell wine at all. It was dumb. In fact, we even use that term for it because it isn't putting out the aromas and flavors that you want. And so temperature is very, very important. One of the reasons why I'm not a big fan of the stemless glasses, because especially, well, for one thing, you get your fingerprints all over it. And the other thing is, especially if it's white, it's going to warm up way too fast. So put ice in it. And so I don't. Food, oh, this stuff, it's just so easy. Again, with the Sonoma Coast or especially the La Cremas, right away, again, if you like it, I think lobster. Butter, again, the simplest thing, butter popcorn. Seafood, maybe certainly in a cream sauce. You could certainly do chicken in a cream sauce, those kinds of things. Vegetarian, you could certainly do, vegetables in a cream sauce. Goat cheese, I think, would not be bad, especially with the Saint Veran. Uh, there's just so many foods that would go so well with it, especially with summer coming and the lightness. And again, maybe this wine or something that's a little bit more oak or butter, even a little bit of grilled can bring out those flavors very, very nicely. So those are some of the things I would do. Anyone else? Oh, terrible question. Terrible question. Hmm. I'll think about that a little bit. You know, I really hate to say it, I probably think they asked me what my favorite wine of these wines were and what my favorite wines in general are. Um, I very often use the term love the one you're with. And very often I do love the wine that I happen to have in my glass. And so that's a cop out. And I'll tell you some more later. Of these wines, They're all good. I chose them because I thought that they would give you a little bit of an idea of the different sides of Chardonnay. But I'm a sucker for white Burgundies, and so I really think I like the Saint Veran best of them. Of my favorite wines, again, certain grape varieties, I really like Pinot Noir, and so I love and can't basically afford Burgundies anymore. There are a lot of good Oregon Pinot Noirs and California Pinot Noirs. I really like. Let me think about this. I like champagne and, in fact, lots of sparkling wines. I drink a lot of sparkling wines. And I keep hoping. It's really interesting how people's psyches work because if you look at the numbers, the again, maybe because people think, we're in a terrible time or whatever. I think what better time to drink champagne or a good sparkling wine? And I do. And if anyone wants to give me any, I'm happy to take it. And so those numbers have gone down tremendously. So there may be some good buys in sparkling wine. And I really do like champagnes, but I like sparkling wines from California. I really like wines from Alsace. A good Prosecco. I'm doing a good Prosecco in class next week. I really like Nebbiolos, in other words, Barolo, Barbaresco. I really like that grape a lot. Whites, I like Gewürztraminers. You can tell I like a fair amount. It's sort of interesting when I go into a store where I gravitate, and that's what you see. Because, of course, I've had wonderful Zinfandels. I've had great Cabernets. I love a good Bordeaux. And a good Chianti. And so I'm probably fairly Catholic in my taste when it comes to that. If the wine is good and of the place, and in many cases has a story to tell, then I'm interested. I would say that's probably the most important thing. Other questions? That was the last one? Okay. Okay, I'm going to just take a moment and thank everyone for their interest. I am sure I have this feeling that there are so many people out there who I know who I would love to hear from. You can certainly get in touch with me if you ever have any questions. And really, thank you so much for spending this time with me this evening. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
But thank you, Jack, for such a wonderful evening. I hope that you all had a great time. The recording will be available on the ALC website, so feel free to share this with your friends or family members that were not able to attend. Also, be sure to check out any other upcoming webinars on the ALC site. We do have quite a few happening over the next few weeks. The Miami University Alumni Association is always working to find ways to keep you connected virtually, so please be sure to follow us on social media and check out our website at miamialum.org to stay up to date with other events and opportunities. And again, I did mention this in the beginning, but I know you couldn't hear me, so remember to head over to the Men's Glee Club virtual concert and watch their recording from tonight. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm sorry you couldn't hear me throughout, and I'm sorry you couldn't hear me in the beginning. I know many of you asked wonderful questions, so I'll try to get those to Jack to answer those. We will send out the recording. And I know many of you asked, there were over 1,300 alumni that signed up for this tonight. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend. And as always, love and honor.